Good evening.
Hello.
Hola.
Good evening.
Hello.
Good
Evening.
Good
How's
evening,
everybody?
everybody.
Good evening, everyone.
Nice, everyone.
We're gonna, I think Daniel and Tony are in the process of letting people in, so I'm gonna give that a couple of minutes to finish up and then we'll get started. Happy Thursday, everyone.
Happy Thursday.
And happy Thursday to you.
All right, are we good? We're good. Okay. All right, so good evening, everyone. My name is Leah LaRue, and I'm the Assistant Director of Neighborhood Planning for the City of Atlanta's Department of City Planning. Very excited to be here with you tonight and have two of my team members with me, Daniel Vasquez, who usually chimes in by now to introduce himself. Daniel?
Oh, hey, everyone.
I can't see all the faces, so I was like, did he step away?
Oh, I
And
was on mute. I'm sorry.
thank you. And Tony McNeil, our Neighborhood Engagement Planner.
Good evening, everyone.
All right. And as I said, I'm Leah LaRue. I'm the Assistant Director of Neighborhood Planning, and we are going to go ahead and get started. Without further ado, welcome to WB, that's Web-Based 1012, which is our Bylaws Clinic. This is now our third time teaching this course. We modify it a little bit every year. If you have already taken the class, then this will be a really good refresher for you. I always tell people when they ask, well, I took it before, should I take it again? Absolutely, especially if you're in certain positions in your NPU, or if you're interested in being in certain positions in your NPU, or you're just interested in the bylaws process, whether in your NPU or your neighborhood association, you absolutely should be here tonight. So I'm glad to see your faces. I'm glad that you're here. I do want to go over, let's see. Okay, there we go. If you have any questions, we will pause for Q&A at different points.
That he thinks will help reduce some of the hesitancy among the unvaccinated.
All right, thank you. So actually what I'm going to do, because I don't want that to happen again. All of the mics. Just one moment, please, if you don't mind. Alrighty. Okay, so if you have questions, we will pause from time to time to take questions. You can raise your hand by hitting that reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see raise hand right there at the bottom. Or if you hit participants at the bottom of the participants list, you will see the raised hand. Now, which one you see, which way you see it will depend on which version of Zoom you have. If you have difficulty finding it, just send a note to Tony or Daniel and we'll help you out with that. All right, so a few classroom rules, and if you've been with us before at Mpu University, excuse me, then you already know how this goes. These are our rules for every single class that we do. Please keep your microphone muted at all times. That cuts down on background noise and feedback from different devices and things that may get too close to the computer, or some kind of electronic weirdness happens and it causes that shrieking sound. If you keep your microphones muted throughout the course, we won't have too much of that, which I'll appreciate. Of course, we'll unmute when you have any questions. At the end of the presentation, or to make a comment or ask a question, you should please raise your hand to get in line. And of course, all questions must be relevant to course content. and beneficial for the class. So we try to avoid situations where a student is asking questions that have some sort of political agenda or motive. You know, obviously we are the city of Atlanta and we live and work in a political climate. So from time to time, it can be tempting to make commentary or ask questions that are not quite relevant to the course content. So I do ask everyone to please keep your questions relevant to course content and beneficial to the entire group. All right, so we can now get started. Why was the NPU system created? Well, in 1974, the first Black mayor of Atlanta, Mayor Maynard Jackson, wanted to make sure that residents, particularly those that are historically disenfranchised, would have the opportunity to weigh in on matters that affected the livability of their neighborhoods. He wanted them to basically have a say-so in what happened in their neighborhood. And more importantly, he wanted for it to be secured so that even after he left office, the power given to the residents, the citizens of Atlanta, would not be stripped away in any way. And so in 1974, the NPU system was created, and it is indeed referenced in the charter, the City of Atlanta's charter, and the charter can only be changed by the Georgia legislature. So there's a little bit of solidity there. The code defines and frames the NPU system in this way. The council finds that it is in the public interest for the City of Atlanta to have an organized program of neighborhood planning. It is the purpose of this article to provide an opportunity both for the citizenry formally to provide input into the comprehensive development plan of the city and to provide a means by which information concerning the operation of city government can be provided to the citizens of Atlanta. Further, it is the policy of the city to coordinate the recommendations of neighborhood planning units with the formulation of the city's budget, both capital and operating, in order that the comprehensive development plan be an effective policy guide for the orderly development of the city. The reason we start this class off that way is that it is impossible to create or amend a solid, strong set of NPU bylaws without understanding the purpose of the NPU system. That is critical. More than half of the calls that I get, emails, calls, visits pre-pandemic, and complaints, almost always complaints, are regarding things that are outside of our scope, my office's scope. And it's usually because so many people don't quite understand the reach of the NPU system, the bounds of the system, if you will, the framing of the system, in fact. So it's really important. And I really like to make sure people understand that. That's why it's still up on the screen. I want to give you a second to read it on your own and reread it. But it's really important for people to understand the fabric of the NPU. All right, so what is the function of bylaws? What do bylaws do? Bylaws are the foundational documents of an organization. They exist to give an organization structure. They define the organization's primary characteristics, how it functions, and the rights and duties of members. Your rights and duties are tied to or solidified in your bylaws. And there are a couple of other places, and I think we'll get to that in this class. If not, I'll talk about it later on. But there are a couple of other places that kind of define your rights. But the bylaws, many of you in the room know that if you come to me with a problem in your NPU, the first place I'm going is to your bylaws. I'm going to look in the bylaws and see what the bylaws say, because that determines my response to you. There are certain things that you can or cannot do, or that your MPU can and cannot do, and it's clearly defined in the bylaws. So that's always going to be the first go-to. I'm sorry, y'all, I'm having difficulties with my presentation here. Bylaws should include the rules an organization deems to be so important that they cannot be changed without previous notice to the members and without the vote of a large majority. Typically, you want your bylaws vote to require a 2/3 majority or a 3/4 majority. You do not want a change to your bylaws to require a simple majority. A simple majority, for those who may not know, is 50% plus 1. So if you've got 40 people in the room, a simple majority would be 20 plus 1 or 21. If you've got 50 in the room, a simple majority would be 25 plus 1 or 26. So you want your bylaws to be pretty solid and difficult to change so that they represent the core, the character, the culture of the organization. These are the most important rules. These aren't the little, flexible kind of not quite as important rules. These are the character of your MPU or your neighborhood association. That's what belongs in your bylaws. And you want that to be tight and difficult to change. Well, not difficult, but requiring a very large majority. So what are the requirements for the MPU bylaws? The city requires that MPU bylaws must be submitted no later than September 30th, and they become effective January 1st of the following year. I want to point out, for those that may be new to the MPU system or just may not know this, when I say the city requires, that means that it is written into the Code of Ordinances. And of course, the Code of Ordinances is the law that governs the city of Atlanta. The code states explicitly that NPUs must submit their bylaws no later than September 30th of each year, and they become effective January 1st of the following year. It also points out in the code that NPUs that do not comply with this requirement will not be able to make recommendations to the city of Atlanta. So if an MPU does not submit its bylaws by September 30th, they will not be able to submit recommendations. Now, obviously, our role here is to support the MPUs as much as we can. So we bend over backwards. We send out reminders, we offer assistance, we conduct this class. We do everything that we can to help MPUs comply. And if more help is needed, we'll certainly provide that. But the code does require, the law does require that the bylaws be submitted by September 30th. Additionally, and this is important, if you are a bylaws committee chairperson for an MPU, or you are the chairperson of the MPU, I need you to really hear this, because way too many of the MPUs forget this step, and it's important. And it's also in the code, so it's required. The bylaws must attach the Code of Ordinances, section 6-3011 through 6-3019. Those are the sections that frame the MPU system. And it's important for that to be attached to the bylaws so that any member of the MPU or anyone who asks for a copy of the bylaws knows what the city requires of the MPUs, knows how the city framed the MPUs, and can see that relationship between the MPUs and the city of Atlanta. Thirdly, there may be no restrictions on a resident's right to vote on bylaws. That is critical. Many MPUs have attendance requirements for voting on zoning matters, special events, alcohol licenses, public funding applications, etc. And that's fine. MPUs are allowed to do that. You absolutely can require that people attend 2 meetings before they can vote, or 6 meetings before they can vote. But you cannot require anything of a member to vote on bylaws. There may be no requirements or restrictions on a resident's right to vote on bylaws. That means if you have never attended an NPU meeting before in your life, and you happen to show up the night that they're voting on bylaws, and you live in that MPU, or you own property in that MPU, or you represent a business in that MPU, you absolutely can vote on bylaws, even if it's your first time walking through the door. That right is protected in the city's code of ordinances. The code requires that there be no restrictions on a resident's right to vote. And I also want to take a minute to clarify how the code defines a resident. We, on our team, we tend to call them members, and you'll probably hear me say that a lot. I use the term interchangeably here and there, but a resident per code is a person who lives in the NPU, who is 18 years or older. You have to be 18 or older to participate in the NPU system. So a person who's 18 years or older and lives in the NPU, or owns property in the NPU, or represents a business, organization, agency, etc. in the NPU. Those three groups of people are automatic members or residents in an NPU. And if you fall into one of those categories, you automatically have the right. The code has given you the right to vote on bylaws. I know I spent a lot of time on that slide, and it's just because I want to make sure that everyone knows their rights. All right, continuing on the requirements for Mpu bylaws, they must be reviewed by the Department of City Planning, and they are reviewed for clarity as to voting procedures, representativeness of all interested parties, and description of the duties of any subcommittees or officers. That has to be spelled out explicitly in the MPUs, and in the bylaws. And that is the part of the bylaws that we review. Okay, let me rephrase that. We review the entire set of bylaws. Every year when we get the bylaws in, it actually goes through a very rigorous process. Bylaws touch the hands of every single member on our team. Each member of our team reviews every set of bylaws that come in, with the exception of the bylaws of their own MPU where they live. And yes, our entire team lives in the city of Atlanta, and we are all members of our MPUs. However, we don't review the bylaws from our own MPUs. We skip those and allow someone else from the team to review those. We're reviewing them in general. We want to make sure that there are no contradictions. That happens from time to time, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But the three things that will cause a set of bylaws to be sent back to the chairperson are one of these three. Clarity as to voting procedures. If that's not clear, we're sending the bylaws back. Representativeness of all interested parties. That has to be both clear and it has to be there. So there has to be representativeness of the interested parties. If the bylaws exclude members of the MPU or residents, we will probably send that back. And we do it, again, we're collaborative with the MPUs. We are a support system. We're like one big happy family. And so if there's an issue there, we're not sending it back like denied, take this back. We're saying, hey, this is a problem. You know, do you want some help with this, or do you want to talk it over with your MPU and get this worked out, but we can't approve it like this? And, you know, we'll work with you for sure. And number 5, bylaws cannot violate law. They cannot violate the city law. They cannot violate the state law. They can't violate federal law. They can't violate the law or county ordinances either. And they should not commit the city or any other entity. I cannot tell you how many sets of bylaws I see that will say something like the MPU planner is required to manage attendance or count votes or something like that. Your bylaws cannot obligate or commit the city officials or any other entity outside of your MPU. That doesn't mean that you can't have a planner count votes for you or hold attendance sheets or anything like that. It just can't be committed in your bylaws, because that's something, just to make sure you understand the logic there. Committing the city could put you in a position to violate your own bylaws. If the planner does not do the attendance sheets, maybe the planner says, no, that's not my job and I don't want to be responsible for your attendance sheet, so I'm not going to do that. Or maybe the planner, I don't know, just whatever the requirement is not something that that planner does. You're then in violation of your own bylaws, but it's not your own fault. So you want to make sure that your bylaws only obligate the people in the organization, in this case, the MPU. All right, I'm going to pause to take some answers here. If you'll raise your hand, and I think I'll be able to see this myself. Yeah, I will. Okay, great. So if you raise your hand with any ideas on how can NPU or neighborhood association bylaws be used to encourage participation? Is there anybody that has an answer to that? How can NPU or neighborhood association bylaws be used to encourage participation? No hands being raised. No hand. Oh, I see hands. All right. First one is Ms. Ramirez. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, hello to everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to teach us, or the ones that don't know. But how can NPU be used to encourage participation? Well, in order to write bylaws, we have to be informed as to what's important to our local communities and what they want to imply or implement in the communities. And we have to be informed, we have to be engaged. And when we are engaged, then we're able to structure what we want our NPUs to do or follow. So I think that bylaws can be used to encourage participation by telling everyone, if you're engaged, if you're in the know or want something changed, attend your NPUs and let your voice be heard.
Awesome, thank you. I see two more hands. Kenneth Akbar, Mr. Akbar, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Ken Akbar. I am the president of the Civic League for a historic community in Southwest Atlanta called Joyland. And I'm just honored to say that my parents bought a house in this community in January 1958. So I took my first steps in this community. And when I got home, because I moved to California in the early 90s, I had been in California 26 years. I've only been home since 2017. And our Civic League had been disbanded. And we really didn't have any records or anything to draw from in terms of reestablishing our Civic League, which we've been blessed to do. So we know that we submitted bylaws that may not necessarily reflect the full vision of our community. And we just want to know how we can go in and make revisions.
Okay, sit tight for me. And
Okay.
We'll talk about that towards the end of the class, okay?
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. And congratulations on starting Joyland's Civic Association back up. I'm very familiar with the neighborhood and it has a very rich history. All right,
Yes,
so
it does.
how can NPU or neighborhood association bylaws be used to encourage participation? One of the tumors has an answer. I'm not sure which one, but I look forward to hearing.
It's Eric. Hi, everybody. How are you?
Hi, Mr. Toomer.
Okay. I would think that one thing that your NPU can do is to set up a committee that actually has a responsibility for recruitment and invite people to the NPU process, and also publicize what your NPU is doing. So that might be something that could be done.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's a great answer. Christy Andrews, you're up next.
I think that it helps that it shows that you're an organized and a recognized NPU or neighborhood association. So then once people see that you're recognized by the city of Atlanta, maybe they might take it a little bit more seriously and want to join in and be more active in the community.
Excellent. And that is definitely true for many. All right, Mr. Martin, you're up next.
There we go. Sorry, it took me a second there to unmute.
No
If people could find their NPU's bylaws on the city's website, it would encourage participation because they would then know the rules of participation before showing up.
That's a really good idea. And in fact, it's almost as though I paid you to say that or something. I like that setup, Mr. Martin. We actually began, I think January, Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think January of this year, we started linking the NPU bylaws to every single agenda. Many people have not even noticed that. But indeed, there is a link to your bylaws at the bottom of your meeting agenda. Every single meeting agenda at the bottom of the agenda links to your bylaws. However, we are in the process of, and some of you have already noticed this because I've gotten notes and text messages from a few people, but we're actually in the process of revamping our website. And we've been in discussions about having one place where all the bylaws are housed. I don't remember whether that has already been done or whether we're still talking about it, but certainly we agree with you, Mr. Martin. We absolutely agree. All right, so I think there were a couple of comments in the chat and then we're going to move on. We post signs in our neighborhood to encourage people to join the meeting and check out our Facebook page to see what is going on in the community. It's not in our bylaws, but it's a way we reach out to neighbors. That's awesome. Specify that items they want implemented have the opportunity to be heard, potentially voted on and rolled into the bylaws. Indeed, that is absolutely important. And that's the way that you can use your bylaws to encourage participation. All right, moving right along. Oh, fun. All right, so this is a very, very general process that can be used to encourage participation in the bylaws process, in the bylaws review, in the bylaws amendment period. Most NPUs and neighborhood associations will start with a committee review. There will be a committee established. In some NPUs, it's a standing committee. In some NPUs, it's an ad hoc committee. But almost every NPU, if not every NPU, has a bylaws committee that reviews the bylaws for that NPU. Then the proposed amendments are drafted. And I will point out that there are several NPUs that do not amend their bylaws every year. In fact, there are some that haven't amended their bylaws in several years. And as long as that works for the NPU, it is certainly fine by the city. As long as you vote, you still have to vote to keep those bylaws. So there still has to be a vote and you have to submit your bylaws to the city with the new year, with the New Year's date, with the new year, I should say, on those bylaws, and then submit it to the city no later than September 30th. You would then distribute the draft of the bylaws with the proposed amendments. So if there are proposed amendments to the bylaws, you want to distribute that to the membership, distribute it as widely as you can. If you've got social media, or you have an email list, or you've got a newsletter, perhaps, whatever it is that you typically use to get the word out, use that and more, double that effort to make sure that far and wide, anyone who touches the NPU has a copy or has access to a copy of the proposed amendments for your bylaws. What you don't want to happen, and I see it every year, we see it every year, what you don't want to happen is for someone to show up the night that the bylaws are being voted on and want to make sweeping changes that will take a whole lot of discussion that the NPU, meaning the members, are not willing to spend time on. And you just don't want that to happen. And so the best bet is to make sure that everyone knows in advance that, hey, we're entering bylaws season. That's why we do this class in July. We want to make sure that you know how to proceed. By now, around this time, your folks should know that it's bylaws time. So then you want to invite proposed amendments. When you distribute the draft that includes the bylaws committee's proposed amendments, you then want to invite proposed amendments from the membership at large. Hey, if you've got any suggestions to strengthen our bylaws or to address this problem that we had last year that we didn't expect to have, we anticipate that we can have it moving forward and we should probably address it in our bylaws. If you've got some suggestions, we invite you to come to our bylaws committee meeting, or you can email your suggestions, or you can pass me a note, or you can leave it in my mailbox, etc. However it works for your NPU. And then you want to finalize a draft after getting all the input from all the people. You finalize the draft and you host a discussion. For some NPUs, that discussion happens right there at the NPU meeting. For some NPUs, that discussion may happen at a bylaws committee meeting or at the executive board meeting. For some NPUs, there are public meetings held. There are several NPUs that hold special meetings just for the bylaws so that everyone can take all the time they need to talk only about bylaws and not have to squeeze in 5 minutes somewhere on an agenda. After that, of course, you're going to vote on it. And again, there can be no restrictions on who can vote on bylaws, with the exception, of course, with the exception being that the code defines who residents are. So anyone who is a code-defined resident of an NPU has the right to vote on bylaws, regardless of any attendance or any other requirements. No dues, no attendance requirements, nothing. All right. Avoiding, before we move on to that, are there any questions about anything that I've said thus far? And I want to keep everyone in, I want you to keep in mind our classroom rules. The number 4 rule is to please keep your questions relevant to course content. So if you've got a question about something that I have already addressed, please do ask your question. I see one hand raised. Miss Adrian, so good to see you. Go right ahead, Miss Adrian. Adrian?
She needs to unmute.
Hypothetically, how can you, is there a limit to how many representatives can come from a business? Can you limit that in your bylaws? Because hypothetically, if someone wanted to like change the bylaws and do away with term limits, they could get a business to bring all of their employees to the meeting. If they work there, they don't live there, but if they only work at the business, how could you prevent that from happening?
So we covered that at the beginning of the class. You don't even need that in your bylaws, because you can have it in your bylaws if you want, for sure, but you don't need it. The code only allows 1 vote per business. So that's in the code. You're already protected there. So only 1 representative of a business can vote.
Only 1. Okay, thank you.
Of an individual business. So you could have 75 businesses in the room, and that is 75 votes, but it's 1 vote per business or organization or agency or entity, etc.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Next, I see Ms. Walker. Very good to see you again, Ms. Walker. Go ahead.
Ms. Walker, you need to unmute, please.
Okay, I just unmuted. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to ask this question. My question goes back to the bylaws not being submitted by September 30th. If the bylaws are not submitted by September 30th, which you said, I think that then you can't make recommendations to the city. So are voting items and reviewing comments still listed on your agenda, even if you didn't meet the deadline for the for the bylaws?
Yes. The
They're
bottom line
still-
is, the answer is yes. We will still list it on your agenda. We will still go through all the motions, but we will fight fervently to get you into compliance before your MPU votes or before your MPU has its next meeting. We work really hard with the MPUs that need that extra support or that extra help. We stay after school every day if we have to make sure that anyone who needs extra help gets it. But the
Okay,
answer to your question is yes, it will appear on the agenda. Theoretically, the recommendation will not be considered by the city council. Theoretically, that's just in theory. That is definitely not, that's not the practice. And I think it's because no one wants that to happen.
right.
Absolutely, no one wants that to happen. So we go out of our way to make sure that the MPUs are in compliance.
Okay, I have one more, may I ask one more question?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, this has to do with being a resident or a member. The way you explain a resident, you're speaking about one individual, correct? You're speaking about one person.
Yes, that's correct. One person.
So if you can have things in your bylaws that says only one person in that household can vote. Is that going against code?
That's a really interesting question. That's a good question.
But if you all have reviewed the bylaws and it's been in the bylaws for years.
Yeah, so let me say this. My immediate answer is that if we're talking about voting on bylaws, that requirement does not stand. Anyone.
No, I'm not talking about bylaws.
Yeah,
I'm talking about voting.
If you're talking about voting on a variance, for example, or an alcohol license or something like that, you're saying the bylaws say that only one person per household can vote.
Right.
You know what? I'm not even going to attempt to answer that question because I have literally never considered all of the possibilities with that. But it's such a good question that I actually would like to ask the law department for their opinion on that. I'm gonna get an answer to that.
Okay, can you just send it to me directly?
Ms. Walker, now of course I will send it to you without a doubt. It's a really good question. In fact, we may send it out to everyone because it's a good question.
But it may not be in everyone else's bylaws. So I'm not trying to muddy up any waters or anything. It's just something that I want to know.
Understood.
Okay.
It's a curious question though, so I'm sure others might want to know too. All right.
Okay.
Ms. James, you're up next. Thank you, Ms. Walker.
Thank you.
Hi, Ms. LaRue. Yes,
Hey,
I'm good. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. I would like to know the answer to Ms. Walker's question as well. So it would be great if you would send that information out because that's a question that is a great question. But I have two of my own. Want to know when you said businesses or who are considered to be residents, if you will, of the MPU, are churches included in that as an organization?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so a church would only have one representative, which would mean one vote.
That's correct. That is absolutely correct. And I'm glad you asked that question because we were asked, I think it was last year, if attending a church makes you a member of that MPU. So if I go to church in your MPU, does that make me a member of MPUI? And the answer is no, unless the church has designated me as the one representative for that church.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering that. And the other thing, when is it recommended that the residents be made known of the bylaws season? I'm glad you said season. I heard you say that that's why you chose to have the clinic in this month, which I appreciate. But when I missed because my screen was going in and out, when did you say is recommended for the residents to be made aware that bylaw season is coming up so that so that it would try to cut down on the, if you have questions or whatever, so that they won't be trying to do all that night or whatever?
Yeah, so I would say no later than July, but I'd also say it's never too early to start. My MPU started work on our bylaws, I think in January, like really early, really early. But some don't start until September 1st. You know, so I don't want to give the impression that all MPUs should start in the first quarter of the year. It really does depend on your MPU. Every single MPU is different. They all have different cultures, a different fabric.
Okay.
And so, you know, it just depends on the MPU, but I would say at the very latest, there should be talk, an announcement or something about bylaws by July.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Miss Adams, you're up next. Linda Adams.
Can you unmute me? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, hey, how y'all doing? I had a question. My hand was raised for the when you asked about how do you encourage residents. I think one way is once the residents of any neighborhood understands what is the purpose of the NPU, that you can get them out to let them know that most of the time when you send out the agenda, it's specified as to what's the purpose of assisting the city of Atlanta with zoning, land use, liquor license, and stuff like that. Because as you know, some NPU has their own bylaws and they put stuff in there that they want to see through the neighborhood. But I think if the city of Atlanta or the chairperson really explain what's the purpose of the NPUL, is an entity under the city of Atlanta, but you're the voice for the people of the neighborhood in which you represent.
That's great feedback. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, Mr. Toomer, I believe you're up next. Mr. Toomer.
There we go. You guys finally allowed me to unmute. Okay.
Well, hold on a second, because I'm gonna fix that. Hold on, just 1 second. Okay, go ahead and unmute Mr. Toomer, and I think everybody should be good to unmute themselves.
Okay, very good. On Mrs. Walker's great question, I would ask that you expand that to include such things in your bylaws as, let's say, the subdivision, and can somebody say that only one person from the subdivision, even though the whole subdivision is made up of individuals and residents? And I think that goes right along with that question. If we can question if a household is more than one person within a household can vote, then we have to also answer if a subdivision could be excluded in terms of the number of people that can represent a vote.
That's interesting. So if that question had been asked of me first, I would have answered that without a second thought. I think that's a lot easier, because if you're in separate households, you are an individual resident, even if you live in an apartment complex or an assisted living facility or a senior high rise or a subdivision, you know, to your point. Those are still individual households, individual families, and they absolutely, I can't imagine that any set of bylaws could, I would answer that question.
That's the way I feel. That's the way I feel about limiting a resident.
No, me too.
One vote per person. So that's why I brought that up, because if you could do it one way, you surely probably could do it another way. So that's why I'm asking that legal actually give a sounding on that.
Oh, so I will check. I'll say it that way.
I understand what you're saying, but my logic just
I
runs
understand.
the same way on both situations. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. And I mean, it's a good point because actually it may sound pretty far off and ridiculous or outrageous, but actually just either this year or late last year, we did have someone charging that there were some illegal, if you will, votes in an election because people that all lived in the same apartment complex voted, and it was felt that they should not have been able to vote because they all live in the same place. So people have certainly said that, and it's not outrageous. I will look into that as well. Ms. Reynolds?
Hello, my question is, someone had asked about if you worship, the church that you worship is in part of your community, in the NPU, is that individual is allowed to vote? Or can they vote if they're designated?
Oh, yes.
To represent, so they can vote?
Absolutely. So if you represent a church, meaning the church has designated you as their official representative for this organization at the NPU, you absolutely are voting, not on your own behalf, but you are voting on behalf of the organization. Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that for me. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. And I see, let me see here. I just lost it. I saw, okay, here we go. Mr. Martin and then Miss Sleeth, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, if an NPU's bylaws make specific reference to neighborhood associations within the bounds of that NPU, does planning then also need to review the bylaws of those neighborhood associations?
No, we don't. And it's always so complicated to explain that. In fact, just either yesterday or the day before, very late at night, I got a very lengthy email from someone leveling a complaint against a neighborhood association. And it's hard because, I mean, y'all know, especially those of you that know me by now, I'm really passionate about civic participation, about community engagement, and about this system. I love the NPU system, and I'm very passionate about it. So it's hard for me to tell someone, I hear you, bro. That is valid. I'd be pissed too, sir, but I can't do anything about that. So no, the answer is no. Even if the bylaws mention, acknowledge, or anything, neighborhood association bylaws, I cannot think of a situation where we would then have to read neighborhood association bylaws or approve them.
So then wouldn't it be problematic if an NPU's bylaws delegated authority to a neighborhood association? Since
so actually we're going to,
that neighborhood association could be anything, right?
Yeah, no, we're going to touch on that a little bit. And I've made recommendations to a couple of NPUs around that area. I've had a couple of NPUs to ask me, can we make requirements of NPU, of neighborhood associations? Like, can our NPU say that in order to be acknowledged as an official neighborhood association in this NPU, you have to be an officially recognized organization in the state of Georgia. Like, you have to have filed articles with the state of Georgia, or maybe you have to have public meetings, or you can't charge dues, or you can't, whatever the restriction may be. And the answer to that is yes. Like with anything else, there are exceptions, but you can define who can participate in your NPU. Absolutely. As long as you're not violating the code, of course. All right, Miss Sleeth. And then Miss Fisher, and then we got to move on. So no more questions at this point, but we'll take some more later. Miss Sleeth?
This is a little complicated. Our NPUN has a board of with representatives from each neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the representative from Druid Hills. Druid Hills is represented by 2 NPUs plus the majority of it is outside the city. So when I bring issues before, like before the board of the Civic Association to vote on about like the new bylaws or any other issue like these new zoning ordinances, can the whole Civic Association vote? Because they're not really, the majority of them don't even live in the city of Atlanta.
Yeah, so can they vote on bylaws? Is that the question?
Right.
I mean, my technical answer would be no, because they're not residents, so they can't be voting members.
So only the people on the board who are residents could vote on issues of the city.
Well, so here's what you could do, Ms. Lee, and you're right, that is complex because I'm familiar with your MPU and it's different. I love the way y'all do it though, by the way. So here's what is different about what you're describing. Your neighborhood association or civic association is taking a vote and bringing that vote to NPUN, and you as the representative are saying to NPUN, our neighborhood would like to see this change to the bylaws, or our neighborhood is in support of the bylaws as they stand. You, right, as the representative, I assume, live in the city.
Yes.
Okay, good. No problems there. So you absolutely can vote on the bylaws on behalf of those people in your civic association because you're the one casting the vote. But here's what's important. For bylaws, everyone in the city, in the MPU, has to be allowed to vote. And I know you all do it differently and it works really well, by the way. But if people were to show up to a meeting, to an MPU meeting, and to an MPUN meeting, and there is a vote being taken on bylaws, all of the people who are qualified, eligible residents can indeed vote, even though you're voting on their behalf, they can vote too. There can't be a restriction on their right to vote.
Okay. All right, but so what if I'm presenting an issue to the board, my civic association, like this new rezoning for the MUMR, and it affects the city of Atlanta, but it doesn't really affect the majority of Druid Hills. So do they get to vote on that? Do they get to tell me, you need to say, yes, we are in favor of this, or no, we oppose this?
So that's for y'all to decide. That's for the civic association to decide. That's not for the city to decide or for the MPU to decide.
Okay. It just doesn't seem like you would want people who don't live in the city to vote about issues affecting the city.
I personally wouldn't, but yeah, but that's definitely. So I agree, but I don't live in a situation like that. So I don't know. You know, that's tricky, but it is up to your neighborhood association to add that to your bylaws. Or the MPU, actually the MPU could put restrictions in its bylaws that address that situation as well. You can handle that either way. Talk to John though. I don't know if you've already talked to John. He may be here. I think he came last year, but yeah, we can talk offline because that's a specialized kind of situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Fisher.
Hi, thank you for taking my question, which is there a benefit to voting on bylaws at a regular meeting as opposed to off cycle? You mentioned some alternatives earlier.
Oh, so those were not for voting. Those were for discussing, debating, deliberating over the bylaws. So those are special meetings, like informational meetings or community meetings to discuss the bylaws. And then you'd vote on them at your regular MPU meeting. I will say this, there's nothing in the code that says you have to vote on the bylaws at your regular MPU meeting, but I'd strongly advise against doing it any other way because you run the risk, a very likely risk, in fact, of having someone say they didn't know this meeting was going to happen. I didn't get, yeah, you sent an email. I didn't get the email. I didn't know that there was going to be another meeting. I've been coming to the NPU on the third Thursday for 20 years. And I expected that we were going to vote on it on the third Thursday. And y'all had this meeting in secret because you didn't want us to really participate. It's not even worth it. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't even do it if I had a billboard advertising the meeting. I absolutely would not advise taking a vote on bylaws outside of the regular meeting.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, y'all, we're going to move on. Everybody, please make sure your mics are muted. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some common mistakes that have been made, and everything that you hear from these next few slides, next couple of slides maybe, are all, they all were learned from experience. Like these all came from true stories, if you will, that have happened, and we learned a lesson from it and addressed it. So you want to make sure that your bylaws include a clear and fair remedy for violations of the bylaws. I get calls all the time, so-and-so is violating the bylaws. Okay. What do the bylaws say that you're supposed to do when so-and-so violates the bylaws? That's my answer. And I know people hate that answer, but it really is like you can go all the way up the chain and everybody above me is going to tell you the same thing. That's the answer. That's the official answer, because the code says that NPUs are accountable to their members. The word that it uses is residents. I use members. The NPUs are accountable to their members. So you're responsible for governing and policing your NPU. Make sure that there's a clear and fair remedy for or process for conflict resolution. You want to include a clear and fair process for officer removal. You want to, of course, hope that you never, ever have to use that process. It's always best for you and for us when things flow smoothly. Sometimes they don't, and you need to remove someone. So, you know, you've got a real simple example is if a person moves out of the city and they're no longer eligible, but maybe they like being vice president and they don't want to give up their seat. They love the neighborhood. They're still willing to come back for the meetings every month. They still want to do the cleanups and they still want to be vice president, but they're not a member of the NPU per the code. And maybe you just want to remove them. You have to have a process to follow. You want to include a process for recognizing new neighborhood organizations. That's another one of those things that's a bit tricky because not all NPUs even recognize neighborhood organizations. Some of them just recognize people, the individuals. Some actually recognize neighborhood organizations. And what it typically means is that at the end of the agenda, if you're doing neighborhood announcements, they get called on, or maybe their name appears in the agenda, or if an application comes to the NPU and it's for a certain neighborhood, it will then be sent to that neighborhood because the NPU recognizes you. But you want to have a process for that, because what can often happen, and it has happened, again, all of this stuff came from real experience. What could happen is a neighborhood association does not like the leadership, the way it's run. Maybe it's corrupt, maybe it's stagnant, they don't meet, they cancel every month, and we're sick and tired of it. We're energized, we're a new group of energized residents, and we care, and we want to start our own neighborhood association. So we do. And then the NPU is like, you're not a part of this NPU. We're not acknowledging your organization. So no, we're not going to ask you for your opinion on matters. We're not going to give you time to speak at a meeting. We're not doing any of that because our bylaws say these are the neighborhood organizations that we recognize. So you want to have a process to change that if necessary, or make clear that you'll never recognize new neighborhood organizations. Whatever it is, you want it to be spelled out in your bylaws. You also want to ensure that one section of the bylaws does not contradict another section. I've seen that many, many times. You want to clarify who can cancel a meeting, under what circumstances, and with what notice. You want to address meeting changes due to public emergencies, acts of God, or other unavoidable circumstances, like the pandemic. I think we learned this one from the pandemic. One of the things that I saw, I think twice, was people like really feeling stuck. I want to call a meeting to find out if my members want to meet virtually, but I can't call a meeting virtually because our bylaws don't allow us to meet virtually. It was a public emergency, so my advice to everyone was to absolutely call the meeting virtually and discuss it there. But people really did recognize that as a loophole in their bylaws. You want to consider policy statements or rules for voting procedures and or other sections that may need to be modified. Everything doesn't have to be spelled out in your bylaws because some things change. Some things can be more fluid and flexible than other things. And so instead of baking it into the bylaws, which is really difficult or should be difficult to amend, you can have a policy statement that your MPU agrees on. For example, we are tired of these organizations taking 25, 30 minutes of our meeting to ramble on about some mural they painted. And we, at the end of the meeting, we have to rush to talk about our own neighborhood stuff. So we have a policy. Presentations only have X number of minutes. That's the policy of this MPU. You absolutely can have a policy statement that is voted on by your MPUs and attached to your bylaws. It's not the bylaws, it's just policies. Many MPUs do that. Several MPUs do that. And then you want to outline the process for record keeping too. Definitely learned a lesson there. You want to outline the process for record keeping. How can your bylaws protect members? So this is an example. Let's see, do a time check. I'm going to take maybe one or two suggestions so that we can stay on time. An outgoing officer asserts that the MPU's social media, website, and other items are the intellectual property or other property of that officer. Any thoughts on what the bylaws could have said or could say to prevent something like this from happening? And again, this is a true story. This happened in real life. Raise your hands if you've got a potential bylaws statement that can protect an MPU against an outgoing officer who says, I created this social media page. I created this website. This is my property. The bookkeeping, I started this system of bookkeeping. This is mine and I'm keeping it. Any ideas? No, so y'all just gonna let the outgoing officer take your stuff? Oh, okay, there we go. All right, so we'll take just these two, Miss James and then Mr. Martin. Oh, and Miss Shorthouse. Miss James. All right, I'm gonna come back to you, Miss James. Mr. Martin?
Can't the bylaws just specify what things belong to the body and how they'll be retained?
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Ms. Shorthouse?
I was going to say the exact same thing.
Yeah, the thing is, so it sounds like pretty obvious there, but the thing is, you don't think about it until it's too late. When you're in that situation is when you wonder, hey, we should probably have something in our bylaws that protects us from having an outgoing officer take our stuff. Adrian Proler?
Yeah, so the other thing that you could do is require in the bylaws that there be more than one administrator, so that one person doesn't have all the control over the website or social media.
Absolutely. And I'll point out that that's important. You know, I hate to talk about the doom and gloom and the horrible things that could happen because they don't usually happen. But the one time it happens, it really messes things up. And I will tell you, the consequence for violating the bylaws say that all property in the name of the MPU belongs to the MPU, not to any individual person. In other words, you start a website with our name, it belongs to us, even if you're the one that started it. But here's the thing. If I'm on my way out I don't care about your bylaws. I don't care about your rules. Make me give it to you. What you gonna do? Make me give it to you. And then I'm gone. So it is important to have more than one person or people from different places even, you know, involved. Ms. James, before we move on, is your mic ready?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, there you go.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say, that I would think that the bylaw should read that anything that carries the name of that MPU belongs to the MPU, and the person can just, if they created it, then create another one when you leave.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, a neighborhood association votes to support an event application, true story. The MPU votes to oppose it. The neighborhood association refers to the bylaws because the bylaws said that the MPU shall support the decision of the neighborhood association. I can't wait to hear one or two of you tell me what the bylaws should say to protect the members in this situation. So again, the neighborhood association votes to support, the MPU votes to oppose, the neighborhood association says, hey, the bylaws say that the MPU is going to support the decision of the neighborhood association. Ms. Adams.
As you said, the bylaws should govern the MPU. However, if an MPU bylaw says that any application comes before the MPU, it shall be sent to the impacted community if there's more than one community in the MPU. If the bylaw also says that the MPU should accept and send the recommendation from the impacted community along with the MPU's recommendation. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the MPU can make its own recommendation. However, if the bylaws say you must send that impacted community recommendation along to the city. So to answer this question, shall the MPU support the decision? It depends on what your bylaw says. Like you always say, what does your bylaw say? So if your bylaw says that the MPU cannot alternate or change any recommendation from the impacted community, can both recommendations go before the city? Yes or no?
You taking me all over the place, Miss Adams. Thank
No, it's real. You always say, what does the bylaw say? So do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I do understand what you're saying. I want to try to stay focused on this though, but I hear you and it makes sense and I do understand what you're saying. Before I respond to that, let me let Christy give her feedback and then I'll respond. Christy, Andrew?
I was just going to say, if you have something that's written that if it impacts more than one neighborhood. So for example, if you're going to do like a fun run and that fun run is going to close some streets down in multiple neighborhoods in the same NPU, then the NPU has to take consideration of those other neighborhoods that are impacted.
Yeah, so that's a very important point as well. That's very important. What I want to say, Mr. Mills, last comment. Mr. Mills, go ahead.
It's actually Nicole. My device is messing up, so we're sharing a screen. But I was just
sorry, Ms. Mills, go ahead.
When it says the neighborhood association refers to the bylaws, which bylaws are they referring to? The neighborhood association's bylaws or the MPU's bylaws? Because just because the neighborhood association's bylaws says that the MPU shall support decisions of the neighborhood association, that doesn't mean MPU has to follow those bylaws.
So that's obligating or committing another entity, and you should never do that in your bylaws. You can't obligate or commit another entity. For clarity though, in this situation, in this real life story, the neighborhood association was referring to the MPU's bylaws, not the neighborhood association's own bylaws, but the MPU's bylaws. And Mr. Martin, seriously, last person. Mr. Martin, go ahead.
It seems like that provision in the NPU's bylaws should have been flagged when planning was reviewing them, as that sort of goes back to my prior comment of how can an NPU delegate authority to someone who is an unknown entity?
So you took the words out of my mouth, somewhat. Those bylaws clause that states that the NPU shall support the decision of the neighborhood association. And to be clear, that statement is not included in the bylaws. That was an interpretation, but that's not what the bylaws in this particular case actually say. Bylaws cannot say that the NPU will support the decision of the neighborhood association, because what you're doing then is predicting or requiring individuals to vote a certain way. If I'm at this NPU meeting and I know that XYZ neighborhood voted to support it, but I am wholly opposed to it, you can't make me vote yes. I'm an individual. You can't make this whole row vote yes. If we all want to vote no, if the whole room votes no, then it's a no. And the bylaws are then violated, I guess, because they're saying that we have to support the decision of the neighborhood. You can't do that. So yeah, that absolutely cannot be in the bylaws. What some NPUs do, I've seen this in a couple of places, is that the NPU will defer to the neighborhood to make the motion. So you can have the neighborhood making a motion on an item, or even speaking. You know, most NPUs do allow the neighborhood to weigh in before everyone votes. And you can absolutely do that, but you can't obligate people to vote for or against something because a neighborhood organization voted for or against it.
Yeah, we have that in our bylaws, but what it says is a resident of the affected neighborhood, not a neighborhood association.
Exactly. And I've seen that as well.
No reference to these other organs of government that aren't really organs of government because nobody is paying any attention to how they govern themselves.
Exactly. Fully agree. All right, next up, y'all. Bylaws state that a certain committee must have 12 members. Any, well, I'm just gonna chime in on this one in the interest of time. Not a good idea to have bylaws require a certain number of members. And those of you that are NPU chairs in the room, you know why that's not a good idea. Good luck finding a committee to have 12 members every year, all throughout the year. You're setting yourself up to violate your own bylaws if you can't get 12 volunteers to be on that committee. So it's best, and I recommended this recently to an NPU, it's best to make that language, if that number is important to you, or you've got some really sound logic behind why you want the committee to have this number of members, highly recommend saying no more than 12 members, or the bylaws chair shall strive to, you know, recruit 12 volunteers, or shall make a solid effort or something like that. That's okay. But if you say that they shall have 12 members, the moment they don't, you're violating your bylaws and you're weakening your bylaws. We had a situation, and actually this happens a lot, where someone will complain that the chair or the NPU or someone is violating the bylaws. And then you look at the bylaws and it's like, well, you violate the bylaws in like 20 different places. It really weakens the bylaws if they're not being upheld. So I always encourage people to revisit them every year. And if you're not doing something that's in your bylaws and you need to adjust either your behavior to match the bylaws, or adjust the bylaws to match your common practice, do that. But don't just live perpetually in violation of your bylaws. It weakens the bylaws. All right, according to the bylaws, members must have attended 3 meetings in the calendar year to be eligible to vote. What could go wrong? Let's see, somebody raise a hand. We'll take 2, 2 people. According to the bylaws, members must have attended 3 meetings in the calendar year to be eligible to vote. All right, Miss Adrian, you're up.
Okay, so one problem with that would be that you're not specifying whether the 3rd meeting could be the meeting where the vote is taken. Is it 3 meetings prior to the voting session, or can the voting meeting be the 3rd?
Simple sentence that could be added to clarify that. members may vote at their third meeting, or members may vote at their fourth meeting in the calendar year, in the previous 12 months, whatever it is. That's good. Thank you for pointing that out. Christy.
What about January meeting? Because if it's a calendar year, would it be like, how do you do January? Because it's the first month, February or March.
Exactly. So there were absolutely some MPUs that had that in their bylaws, that language right there in their bylaws. It doesn't work because in January, nobody's eligible to vote. In February, nobody's eligible to vote. In March, they may or may not be eligible, depending on whether you mean on the third meeting or after 3 meetings. So very tricky language and very easy to fix. Miss Sleep.
Who on earth would keep track of that?
Thank your secretary. In most MPUs, the MPU secretary is responsible for keeping the attendance. Usually, this is a good opportunity to clear something up. Our office is not responsible for keeping attendance. A lot of folks think that we are, or think that we do, and we're not at all responsible for keeping attendance for MPU's meetings. Usually the secretary does that. Oftentimes it could be an assistant secretary or even a vice chair. Depends on what the bylaws say. Ms. Sanchez, did you have a question or you had a comment on the question?
No, I just had feedback to provide on that one, to possibly add a clarifying statement to add whether it will be virtual or in-person meetings, because of course with our environment now, it doesn't state that. So it leaves room for people to question which meetings we will be counting.
And listen, some of this stuff sounds like duh, really obvious, but you'd be surprised what people, you'd be really surprised what people will challenge. And you just don't want to leave room for it to be challenged if you can avoid it. I don't know if there's ever going to be a perfect set of bylaws that have no aha moments like, ooh, didn't even think of that. There probably won't be, but if it's a fixable loophole and you see it from the beginning, you may as well go ahead and fix it. Ms. Ramirez, last hand before we move on.
Yes, ma'am. So this might be a little off, but I remember initially when we started, what are requirements of Mpu bylaws? One of those was not restricting a resident's right to vote. Would that be part of number 4? I know some MPUs do it, but would that be part of number 4?
No, because that is only for bylaws. So the requirement that you cannot restrict a member's right to vote only applies to bylaws. It does not apply to anything else, only to bylaws. And most MPUs are not voting in the first 3 months on bylaws, but even if they did, the code supersedes that anyway. All right. Okay, so last one. The majority of the MPU's executive board and members are business representatives. Residents assert that non-residents vote against the interests of the residents. So you've got an MPU where there are a bunch of business representatives that are active in the MPU and just a few residents, people who live there,